What would you do if your boss asked you to complete an impossible task? I don't mean that you've been told to work an extra shift or the weekend to meet a tight deadline. I mean you've been asked to do something that is literally impossible. This was the situation that a man named Ibn al-Haytham faced in Cairo in the year 1011. It should be said that the problem he confronted was partly of his own making, as he'd sown the seeds of his possible downfall some years earlier. With the scientist's inquiring mind, he'd wondered if it would be possible to introduce a hydraulic system into the Nile River in order to regulate the flow of its water. Now, Egypt's agricultural wealth depended on the Nile's annual flooding, so any ruler of Egypt would be thrilled with the man who could show him how to control this natural phenomenon. And he very likely would display equivalent anger to the man who failed. The Fatimid Caliph in Cairo at the time was a temperamental young man named Al-Hakim, who had a violent temper. In the West, at least, he was known as Hakim the Mad. Unfortunately for the hero of our story, after working on the Nile project for some time, Al-Haytham realized that the feat of controlling the river's flooding was beyond his power, given the technological limitations of the day. And it wasn't as if Egyptians hadn't already spent millennia tackling the problem without success. The only thing that Al-Haytham could think to do that might just save his neck was to pretend to be insane, and the plan worked. Al-Haytham spent a decade under house arrest in Cairo until the caliph died. But the unfortunate dreamer's life was spared, and there was even better news than that. Left alone at home, surrounded by his library, Al-Haytham spent these years writing one of the most important scientific works of the 11th century. Al-Haytham's 7-volume Book of Optics changed human understanding of how light and vision interact. I'm going to start this lecture by discussing the place of Fatimid Cairo in the wider context of the Islamic Golden Age, which ran from 750 to roughly 1260. From there, we'll look more closely at Al-Haytham's life and work, and, notably, his important contributions to the field of experimentation in scientific inquiry. It is work that has led many modern scholars, including the British theoretical physicist Jim Al-Khalili, to call him the first true scientist. After that, we'll turn to Al-Haytham's focus on optics and his influence on its study during the Islamic Golden Age and later in European scholarship. So let's begin in Cairo, the city where Ibn al-Haytham spent most of his professional life. Egypt might be an ancient civilization, but Cairo was a new city at the time, having been established in 969, just 4 years after Al-Haytham's birth. The Fatimids conquered Egypt that same year and proceeded to establish Cairo as their new imperial capital. It was just a few miles downstream from Fustat, the country's first capital, which had been built some 2 centuries earlier, after the Muslim conquest of Egypt, a province of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Fustat was still a large and important city, but the Fatimids were determined that their new capital would be even larger and grander, and so it proved. Today, Fustat is known as Old Cairo, and it's contiguous with the Fatimid capital in Cairo proper. Life in Cairo and the rival Abbasid seat of power in Baghdad shared a great deal in common. To start with, daily activities revolved around the market and the mosque, and for most people in that order. Markets supplied food, jobs and trade. The mosque itself generally was built next door and might have been the centre of religious and political life in the city. But eating and making a living were of primary daily concern. The agricultural wealth generated in the Nile Valley and Delta, and trade revenues earned across the realm, helped the Fatimid Empire grow rich from taxes. In turn, prosperity and political stability brought investment to the imperial capital, and Fatimid caliphs spent freely in order to compete with Abbasid Baghdad. In time, Cairo rose to become a new centre of intellectual endeavour in the Muslim Middle East. And one of the first objectives the Fatimids pursued in this regard was to establish a religious and educational centre that would promote their own brand of Islam, that is, Ismaili Shia Islam. The University Mosque Complex of Al-Azhar, founded in Cairo in 970, the city's second year of life, soon established a pre-eminent position in the world of Islamic scholarship, which it maintains to this day. Today, however, rather than a centre of Shia learning, since the downfall of the Fatimids in 1171, Al-Azhar's reputation stands as the world's leading centre of Sunni learning. The Fatimids also established a palace with a grand library in Cairo. According to some sources, this royal library encompassed 40 halls stocked with more than 200,000 volumes. Some 18,000 of these were said to be translations of ancient Greek texts, mainly dealing with scientific inquiry, from mathematics and physics to chemistry, medicine and astronomy. In the year 1005, the sixth Fatimid Caliph, Al-Hakim, whom we were introduced to as Hakim the Mad a few moments ago, established his own Dar al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, to challenge Baghdad's more famous centre of the same name. A mercurial and possibly cold-blooded ruler, Al-Hakim nevertheless admired learning and was happy to spend freely to acquire the best minds money could buy. However, the Shia Fatimids were also seen as heretical in the eyes of the Muslim world's Sunni majority. And so the caliphs struggled to attract the best Sunni scholarship, until they started offering ever larger financial incentives. So far, I've been referring to Abu Ali Hassan ibn al-Haytham by the name he's known in the Middle East, and increasingly in the West too, during contemporary times. In the medieval West, however, he was more often referred to as Al-Hazen, derived from one of his given names, Hassan. Medieval European scholars also granted him the honorific Ptolemeus Secundus, or the Second Ptolemy. Al-Haytham was born in 965 in the port city of Basra in modern-day Iraq. Much of the lands we know of today as Iraq and Iran were ruled then by the Buyids, a regional Shia Muslim dynasty. Unlike the Arab Fatimids, however, the Buyids were Persians. And because the Buyids and other Persian dynasties dominated much of the broader Middle East at this time, the mid-9th to mid-10th century is sometimes referred to as a Persian intermezzo. Al-Haytham's family must have been relatively prosperous and well-connected, because he received a first-class education. Like the names of many learned men associated with the Islamic Golden Age, Al-Haytham was a polymath, having expertise in numerous different fields of study. Al-Haytham was noted for his skills in mathematics, especially geometry, astronomy and meteorology, as well as the field of optics, which is our main focus in this lecture. In all, he authored something in the region of 100 titles. Other sources suggest as many as 200, but this likely includes duplicate works and essays counted more than once. Of the total, about 25 deal with mathematics and number theory, and some 45 with the natural sciences, including physics, chemistry, and geology. Among his works are such colourful titles as On the Nature of Shadows, Horizontal Sundials, On Rainbows and Halos, On Squaring the Circle, and On the Light on the Moon, in which he proposed that the moon took its light from the sun. Now, that paper, On the Light of the Moon, wasn't the only time Haytham tackled a lunar-related question. Think about this. Have you ever wondered why the moon appears larger the closer it gets to the horizon? The same is true when we observe the rising or setting sun. If so, you're not alone, and certainly not the first. The question of why the moon appears larger when it's close to the horizon compared to when it's high in the sky has become known as the moon illusion, and it has troubled scientists and thinkers as far back as Aristotle during the 4th century BC. Indeed, the moon illusion might just be the oldest unsolved scientific puzzle there is. It's an optical illusion, of course. Aristotle and other great Greeks, including Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, wrongly believed that they were seeing the moon or sun being magnified as it came into closer contact with the Earth's atmosphere. Haytham thought otherwise, and he correctly redefined the Greeks' view by demonstrating that instead of a physical phenomenon, what's happening with the moon illusion is a matter of visual psychology, not physics. I'm going to keep talking about the moon illusion, both because it has a pleasant alliterative sound and because it's a comprehensible phrase. For the more scientifically inclined student, what Haytham proposed is more properly called the size-distance invariance hypothesis, or SDIH for short. I hope now you appreciate why I'm going to stick with moon illusion. Haytham's hypothesis explained why an object could appear larger if it is perceived to be further away, as being in the realm of visual processing taking place in the brain, without any relation to the external reality of the size of the moon or other observed object. Astonishingly, scientists have yet to come up with a conclusive explanation for exactly how the moon illusion occurs. Even so, virtually all credible contemporary theories are variations of Haytham's SDIH explanation, which he wrote up 1,000 years ago. It seems only right and proper that the moon has a crater named for the great man using the Latinized version of his name, Alhazen. For all that he's written, there's much that we don't know about Haytham, including whether he was a Shia, as would befit a rising young man in the Shia Buyid polity, and who would make his life's work in Shia Fatimid Cairo. But to the contrary, the majority of inhabitants in each place was not the ruling Shia, but the subordinate Sunni. Haytham himself once observed, as a young man, that being confronted by so many different faiths had led him to doubt them all, and that he'd rather see truth as indivisible. Later in life, he somewhat moderated this view, stating that truth could only be reached through opinions whose matter was sensible and whose form was rational. And this latter sentiment tells us something about the rational approach that Haytham would employ throughout much of his work and life. After moving to Egypt in his 20s, Haytham occasionally supported himself by translating Greek works into Arabic. One result of this was that he read and reread numerous texts that were central to ancient Greek mathematics, including Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's almost canonical work of astronomy, the Almagest. Such familiarity with Greek learning no doubt aided Haytham's own research. However, while even the greatest of ancient Greek scholars understood the role of experimentation and empirical data, in practice they often ignored it. All too often, the Greeks overlooked the central and critical importance of empirical evidence when advancing a scientific argument, frequently offering a theory as proof instead. Now, this wouldn't do for Haytham. He tested and retested each and every idea, and he would announce a successful result only after he believed that sufficient measurement and tests showed something to be demonstrably, not just theoretically, true. As a result, today he's rightly regarded as the father of scientific inquiry. The seeker after the truth, Haytham once said, is not one who studies the writings of the ancients and, following his natural disposition, puts his trust in them, but rather the one who suspects his faith in them and questions what he gathers from them, the one who submits to argument and demonstration and not to the sayings of a human being whose nature is fraught with all kinds of imperfection and deficiency. Thus, the duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads, and applying his mind to the core and margins of its content, attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. Now let's turn our attention to Haytham's most important contribution to science, which is his work on optics. Until then, essentially, there existed two theories about light and vision, both of which had competed with one another since they were first posited in ancient Greece. One was the emission theory, which held that vision functioned because the eye emitted or sent out rays of light. This was supported by such great names as Euclid and Ptolemy. The second theory, that of intromission, argued that observed physical forms somehow entered the eye. Aristotle, who died in 322 BC, was one famous advocate of this perspective. And while he was essentially correct, Haytham's research went much further. As well as building on Aristotle, Haytham also advanced the work of the great Greek physician and surgeon Galen of Pergamon, who died around 200 AD. Specifically, Haytham developed Galen's work on the anatomy and physiology of the eye and its workings, while also presenting practical demonstrations as proof. In addition to these theoretical investigations, Haytham was a medical practitioner who took a special interest in diseases of the eye. In actual practice, he was an early adopter of a technique for removing soft cataracts by means of suction and a hollow needle. This technique would later be taken up in France, but not until some 800 years later, in the 1840s. The idea that the human eye emits rays of light, and that this is the basis of vision, no doubt strikes some of us today as silly. But in Haytham's time, this was thought at least as credible as the opposite theory. And no wonder. In the face of such revered names as Ptolemy and Euclid, it took a brave individual to challenge the scientific orthodoxy. However, Haytham's scientific research not only stopped critics in their tracks, but it also provided a bulwark of hard evidence for his conclusions. More than half of the books Haytham wrote no longer survive. But this hardly matters when we consider the impact that his most famous and enduring work had on the science of optics. The Book of Optics, or Kitab al-Manazir in Arabic, was written during that blessedly peaceful decade of house arrest between 1011 and 1021. This 7-volume study deals variously with colour, light, vision, and visual theory. His ideas address errors of visual perception, including optical illusions. One entire volume considers the concept of refraction, and 2 volumes provide his experimental evidence. So, complete with theories, experiments and proofs, this was a real science textbook in a way that earlier books dealing with similar matters simply weren't. Haytham offered the following observation, settling the question of light and the eye by stating that when the eye is opposite a visible object and the object is illuminated with light of any sort, light comes to the surface of the eye from the light of the visible object. This entirely accurate belief that light enters the eye would prove to be a powerful and effective rebuttal to both Ptolemy and Euclid, who believed just the opposite, that is, that the eye emitted or sent out light. Haytham's experiments tested how light passed through various media, from paper and glass to water and smoke. And his observations led to a lifetime's fascination with refraction, or how light bends. By experimenting with mirrors and lenses, and a construction that would later become known as the camera obscura, that's Latin for dark room, Haytham also became the first person to demonstrate that light travels in straight lines. He stated the case thus: from each point of every coloured body, illuminated by any light, issue light and colour along every straight line that can be drawn from that point. He added, let an experimenter take a solid object, make a tiny hole in it, then hold it opposite the sun. He will find that the light goes through the hole moving along a straight line. If he tests the light as it extends through space, he will find it to be perfectly straight. It is therefore clear from this that the light of the sun only extends along straight lines. With an interest also in meteorology, Haytham started observing the sun and the moon and the stars in, pardon the pun, a whole new light. He would pose the exact same questions that parents and grandparents must field from curious offspring. Entirely reasonable questions such as, where do rainbows come from? And why is the sky blue? And if Ptolemy and Euclid were right that vision comes about because the eye emits rays, then, reasonably, every child must be right who ever believed that if they shut or covered their eyes so they can't see you, then you can't see them. Haytham's observations led him, once again, to question the master, Ptolemy, whose theory of planetary movement wrongly had the sun and the stars all revolving around the Earth. In spite of his belief that Ptolemy was wrong about planetary movement, he wasn't sure why. That is to say, he couldn't prove it. It must have been very frustrating for someone who put so much faith in the scientific method, which is the systematic observation and measurement to prove a hypothesis, that he was unable to use this scientific method to prove Ptolemy wrong. But then again, that's because Haytham's research was hamstrung by living in a world without telescopes. Now, even though Haytham wasn't personally able to answer all the questions he set for himself, at least he was asking the right questions and writing them down. In this way, Haytham's surviving writings sent generations of scientists in the right direction. Let's now detour for a moment to consider the intellectual fate of Fatimid Cairo. Today, more than 800 years after its founding, the mosque-university complex of Al-Azhar retains primacy in the world of Sunni learning. But apart from that, Cairo's moment as the brightest star in the firmament of human intellectual development is over. With the overthrow of the Fatimids in 1171 by the legendary Kurdish Abbasid general Saladin, the caravan of knowledge and learning moved westward. Crossing the deserts of North Africa and the waters of the Mediterranean, this collective wisdom would eventually land in the Muslim polity that was Al-Andalusia on the Iberian Peninsula. There, in the great southern cities of modern Spain, a new impetus for translation and study was born. This time, the texts arriving were in Arabic, and they were translated into Latin and Hebrew. And this is the most likely way by which Al-Haytham's work reached the West. Western scholars paid attention to this latest work to emerge from the Muslim Middle East, and it wasn't too long before its impact was felt for medieval and later scholarship. As for the legacy of Al-Haytham, his book of optics was translated into Latin by an unknown scholar at the end of the 12th century or possibly at the start of the 13th century. And it's from this point on that he's remembered as Al-Hazen rather than Al-Haytham. Now, in point of fact, no printed Latin edition of the Book of Optics actually appeared until 1572. But the great English scholar Roger Bacon wrote his own summary of it before the end of the 13th century. And it soon was transported to all the major centres of learning in Britain and continental Europe. And so, in the best traditions of scientific inquiry that Al-Haytham did so much to promote, we'll demonstrate his influence by citing those who acknowledged their debt to Al-Hazen, as these Western scientists knew him. Earlier, I mentioned the camera obscura, Latin for dark room. It's essentially a box of any size, or even a room, that allows light in through a pinhole aperture. It then displays an inverted image of what's outside on the inside wall of the box, or room, that is the camera obscura, opposite to where the light enters. Although the theory behind it was known to the ancient Greeks, it was Al-Haytham who first produced a working model that proved invaluable for his optical experiments. Basing his design on his own anatomical investigations of the human eye, Al-Haytham was thus able to produce a fully functioning camera obscura about 500 years before Leonardo da Vinci is credited with its use in Renaissance Europe. Now, da Vinci was considered a credible scientist whose wave theory advanced the cause of optical science. However, da Vinci, like many of his contemporaries, was clearly interested in the artistic applications of the camera obscura device. Whereas for Al-Haytham, the camera obscura was all about science rather than art. The late 13th century Polish friar, theologian, scientist and mathematician Wojtyła relied heavily on Al-Hazen for his own 10-volume work, Perspectiva, or Perspective, which in turn was used very widely by later European scholars. After Wojtyła, for example, there were the 17th century German astronomer, astrologer and mathematician Johannes Kepler, and the English physicist and mathematician Isaac Newton, as well as the Italian Galileo Galilei. So, was Al-Haytham the first true scientist? Very possibly, yes. But it all depends on how you describe the term. And in definitional terms alone, it's a hard case to prove, something that Al-Haytham would have insisted on. What we can say with certainty is that in 1676, when Isaac Newton wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," he was acknowledging a debt to, among others, Al-Haytham or Al-Hazen, the man whose approach to the received Greek wisdom on optics and more was to look and to look again.